Hi there, it is Prakash, Head of Product of Xano again, and we're doing part 2 of our database videos. So if you haven't watched part 1 yet, we're going to put the link in the description below. But we basically cover the basics of what a database is, what its role is in the backend infrastructure or architecture. And then we also talk about the differences between SQL and NoSQL, or a relational database and a non-relational database. So if you want to understand that as a good foundation, go back and watch part 1. In this second part, we are going to be building on that knowledge and first talking about how data is traditionally queried from a database like a SQL database or a NoSQL database. And this is going to be important because it kind of really gives us a good educational foundation around how data is gotten, how programming languages interface with that, and then we're then going to move into a Xano demo around how I think about building database and database design and building simple relationships. In part 3, we're going to cover the more complex topics like add-ons and joins, and that's again covering ways to join tables together to get the information that you want, or decorating the information with other table relationships. So let's get started and let's talk about querying data from the database. So when we talk about querying data, you don't necessarily need to understand what's happening on the screen, but the takeaway that I want you to have is that in SQL, if you basically interfaced in the console with a SQL database like MySQL directly, you might write a statement like this to get information out of the table, right? So this is basically selecting data from the company, and then it's joining the location together with it. In the NoSQL database, you might write something like this. So it's a little simpler, and you might use something like MongoDB to write this in. But as you build in the complexity and the types of data that you want, this obviously can get more complex. So the reason why I wanted to show this is to just show you the raw code that you would use if you're using a SQL or NoSQL database to query that database. And again, why this is important, and what most people don't realize, is that any programming language that people say they use, whether it's like, oh yeah, I write in PHP or Python or Node, all they're doing is writing ways to query the database. So anytime they're programming in it, these certain programming language are opinionated around how you query the database and how their database queries are structured, but that's all it's doing. So when people say that they program, especially in web-based applications, they are writing queries to the database and then using the code to transform the data that they're getting back and to pass it to the front end. And it's the same in the no-code community, right? So if I am in a no-code space, whether you're using Xano or Airtable or AppSheet or any other no-code backend tool, the heart of everything is in the database, and the tool itself is really meant to take that data, present it to you in a certain way, or allow you to transform it and send it back to the front end. So we're always working and really breaking down to the raw SQL or NoSQL code at the end of the day, whether you use a programming language or you use a no-code backend. So that's, I think, something that is important to realize and to know. Okay, so we are here in Xano, and I'm going to create a workspace called a job board, right? So I'm going to do the backend for an application that powers a job board that allows companies to post their jobs at certain locations. So when I hit continue, I have a couple ways to start. I'm going to start from scratch because we're going to build this together. So I have my user table that's already there. I definitely want that. I also want a company table, right? Those are going to be my companies. I also might want a job table, right? So those are the jobs of the company. And then I want a location table, and that's going to be locations that jobs are located at and that companies offer, right, as their different offices. So I like to think about this as like the high-level entities that make up my project. And this is very much a SQL or a relational database type setup. If I was doing a pure NoSQL setup, then I might just kind of have users and jobs. And then on the job table, everything that I need to know, including the company and the location, would be in one row in one document. But traditionally, what I have found, this relational setup gives you the most flexibility around making sure that you're building in the right way, and then you can connect the data together later. And even if it isn't quite as fast as NoSQL, you're not going to notice a speed difference till you get very far out there, and you can always restructure your data later. So anyways, I have these high level entities. I'm going to go ahead and create them. I'm going to skip adding features. I'm not going to add any logins for now. And then I'm going to go into the database. So as you can see, 4 tables were created here. So let's go ahead and start adding a couple things. I'm actually going to start by adding a couple locations first. So I'm going to go and add a text field type. I'm going to say the name of the location. If I wanted to, I could get really specific and do geography. I could do a point, and I could say address, right? And then here I could even summon Google Maps and then like put it exactly where I wanted to, right over here, where I could find an address. I'm not going to get that complicated for now, but just know that Xano supports that. So I'm going to delete that for now. So I just want the name of the location. I'm going to say Los Angeles, and then I'm going to do another location, and I'm going to say Paris, and then I'm going to do Berlin. So these are all different cities. Okay, so I have these 3 locations. So now that I have the 3 locations, I'm just going to go ahead and I'll go into company next. And for company, I want 2 things. I want the name of the company, and then I could do just a table reference to a location, right? And so for example, let's say Xano, and I can say Xano is located in Los Angeles. So that normally would be good, except some companies have multiple locations, and you got to think through that as you're modeling out and thinking through the structure of your application. So I'm going to delete this right now. And then I'm going to add a field, and I'm going to do an object. And an object is a way to kind of have a list of entities. And this is the power of Xano. It gives you this NoSQL type flexibility where you can add multiple objects and entities within those objects, but in this relational way, right? And so what I'm doing right now would not be possible, at least the way that I'm doing it in a SQL setup, but Xano allows you to. So adding a object, I'm going to call this locations, and I'm going to change the structure from a single to a list, okay? And so I'm going to click save because I want a list of company names. So now I want to add schema to this, and I'm going to say this is a table reference to location, right? So now let me go back to show you. It basically creates an empty object, right? This is actually an array. An array is basically just an object list. So now it allows me to add multiple locations. And so when I do that, I can say, well, Xano's only located in Los Angeles. Fair enough. We're still growing. But for example, maybe a company like Google might have 3 locations. It might be located in Berlin and Paris and Los Angeles, right? So I have all of these things here. Another cool thing about SQL versus NoSQL, remember in the SQL documentation, this is not, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about is that even though you're seeing these names listed here, this is something that Xano automatically does for you. But if you go to your API endpoint, and if I go to the get company command or API endpoint, and I ran this, you can see that it's only giving me 3, 2, 1, and 1, right? Because technically we are in this SQL relationship type world where I have to tell Xano explicitly, hey, turn these into the actual names, which we're going to cover in part 3. But for now, let's go back to our database table and let's work in here. So just remember that even though you're seeing this here, it's really being stored by the different IDs. And this is what's different about the NoSQL world. In the NoSQL world, you would just write out the names. You would write out Los Angeles, Berlin, Paris, and Los Angeles. And when you ran it, you would get all of that information. But imagine, for example, if you made a spelling mistake on one of them, there's nothing tying it together, right? So it might be, Los Angeles might be misspelled here, but it's not going to be spelled correctly over here. So that's some of the differences between SQL and NoSQL and why I always like to start in this relational type world. Okay, so I've added the 2 locations over here and I've added 2 companies. So now next I want to go to a job, and the job is going to have a title, right? And it'll also have a location. Where's the location? And actually it has a company, of course. It has a company, and a job only is probably tied to one company. So that's how I'm going to build it. as a single reference. And it might be tied to many locations, right? So a job can exist at one company in the Berlin office and the Los Angeles office. So I'm going to do an object. I'm going to say locations, and I'm going to change this to a list, and I'm going to click save. And then here again, I'm going to do that table reference to the location, and I'm going to just say, let's create our first job. I'll just say software engineer, and this is tied to Google. And I'll just say that it is in Berlin and Los Angeles, okay? And then I'll do one more job here, and that will just be UX designer. And I'll just say that's Xano, and then I will say that this is just in Los Angeles. Okay, so now that we've done that, we have our job table done, and we also have our location table done. So now let's go to the user, and let's add a couple fields. So I'm gonna add a name of the user. Let me change this. I'll go rename, and I'll just say full name, right? So I can be explicitly clear, and then I can go email address, email address here, and I'll click save. And then afterwards, I want one table reference, and I'm going to do that table reference to a job, right? So maybe the user can like save jobs, or actually, now that I'm saying that, let's make this multiple jobs. So let's get that out of the way. Let's do a object. I'm going to say jobs. I'm going to make this a list, and then I'm going to click save, right? And then I'm going to do a table reference to a job. Okay, great. And I'll go ahead and add me as the first user, Prakash. I'll say prakash@email.com, and I'll say that the job that I'm linked to is the UX designer. Okay, so yeah, now I've worked all of this out. I have companies, I have jobs, I have locations, and I have my user. So this is the basic structure around how I basically use the high level entities of my job board application, and I built this out. In the next video, what I'm going to do is really work in the API. And for example, if I want to go to a particular location, if I run this right now, it's just giving me all of the locations that I have. But what if I wanted to see the jobs associated with that location? How would I do that? And so we're going to cover all of that in the next video. Thank you so much for sticking around. Hope it was helpful, and I'll see you in the next.